box. You opened it. We came.
It's just a puzzle box!
Oh no.
So welcome back to another episode of the Cult Classic Show, a show in which I discuss various older films that may not have as much recognition as I believe they deserve, films that have a small but very vocal niche audience, or films that are very well respected that I just wanted to talk about. And that is mostly the case with the movie I'm talking about today. As you can see, it is the 1987 classic film Hellraiser, or more specifically, Clive Barker's Hellraiser. One of the big reasons I wanted to discuss this film was because I had never seen it before up until recently, and it was an incredibly interesting experience that I want to discuss. But not only that, when I was watching this film for the first time, I've been recently going over older horror franchises. I recently watched all of the Halloween movies, all of the Nightmare on Elm Street movies, and all of the Friday the 13th movies, and this is the series I'm currently going through now. But when I was watching the original, my roommate came in and had no idea what this movie was, had never heard of it, had never seen anything about it, and that got me thinking a little bit about how widespread the knowledge of Hellraiser is. And even though it's a classic to me as far as I am aware, it doesn't seem to be in other realms of people. But I still wanted to discuss this, not only because of that, but because, again, I had just barely seen it for the first time. This wasn't ever a series where I felt the overwhelming desire to watch, and even before watching the original Hellraiser movie, I didn't feel particularly compelled to see it. I mean, you look at movies like the original Halloween, and that is a bona fide classic. It's like essential viewing at this point. And even Nightmare on Elm Street, Freddy Krueger is an incredibly, recognizable horror villain, and even Jason is. But Pinhead, not so much. And what the interesting part of all this is to me is that Pinhead in the first movie isn't even that big of a deal. It's not in the same realm of the original Friday the 13th where Jason isn't in the movie, period, but he is not really the villain of this. He's barely in it, in fact. And that was one of the more interesting aspects of it for me. There was an incredible overarching theme of sexuality, of pain, of torture, of horror, and it was an incredibly interesting watch that I really enjoyed. Now, this came out again in 1987, and I mentioned those other horror franchises that I've been watching because this came out right in the thick of it. You had Nightmare on Elm Street 3 that came out the same year as this, Friday the 13th 7 that came out the same year as this, and a bunch of other slasher type movies that came out the same year as this did. And yet, the easy thing to do would be to make a slasher. But Clive Barker made a hypersexual, weird, disturbing, gruesome movie about abuse, about promiscuous people in marriage, and about sadomasochism.
We want the man who did this.
I watched this movie, and there was a lot that I was left to chew on, which I was very pleased with. This may be one of the more intriguing horror movies from that era that I've seen. Now, this became a whole franchise, and from what I understand, the longer it goes on, the worse it gets. The most recent one, which was Hellraiser Judgment, came out 2 years ago, and it's basically a straight-to-video movie. So this franchise has had a large fall from grace, but that first movie has a lot of things that are very special. Now, the film itself is very simple. The premise, at least, is very simple. The opening scene is a character that you get to know more as the movie goes on. His name is Frank, and he gets a little box. And he opens the box, and Pinhead and his Cenobite cohorts come and essentially kill him. You don't get to see it straight away, but they murder him. And then you see a lady, Julia, and her husband move into the same house where Frank was killed. And the movie is all about their story at the end of the day. And there's a little weird thing that happens where the husband of Julia gets cut and he bleeds all over this floor in a very specific room, and Frank is reborn in a disgustingly goopy fashion in one of the best scenes in the movie. And from that point on, you learn that Frank and Julia sort of had an affair before she was married, and now she's going to help him restore his body. And that's basically the premise. It's basically about these two people, again, sort of going behind the back of certain people and doing more or less evil things. I mean, she murders people quite frequently, and he uses their corpses to reinvigorate his body, which is such a bonkers, ludicrous premise, especially, again, around the time of the slasher movies. And that's one thing I loved about this. It is a lot more intelligent and articulate in the way it delivers its horror than the majority of horror films, both back then and now. This film seems to relish the opportunity at making intelligent decisions, especially with Pinhead. Pinhead is an incredibly articulate, wordy villain, and who isn't really even a villain, which is very interesting. He only appears a couple times again, and he's not really a malevolent force, and he's not really a good person either. He's sort of this neutral body that just comes when he's summoned to deliver pain and pleasure to the human form. And that's more or less his purpose, at least in this movie. And he has his little acolytes, the Cenobites, who all have these deformities to them. He has pins drilled into his skull, and another one has their larynx opened up. Another one is like a Twinkie, like a big fat Twinkie, who has his stomach ripped up. And one is his head is completely covered except for his teeth, which his jaw is ripped open to reveal these teeth. And they're all incredibly interesting looking. They all have a very unique and distinct features that make them very nice and interesting to look at, which I really enjoyed. I really loved a lot of the artistic decisions in this movie. Now, it is very low budget. There is very few sets. There's very few actors. They're mostly just in a house. But it works really well because of the artistic license that's taken in this movie and all the creative decisions that were made here.
Frank.
No. We had to hear it from your own lips.
I mean, you easily could make a figure like Pinhead a malevolent force that is summoned like a demon to just murder people. It'd be so easy to do that, and yet that's not the case at all. In fact, the villain of the story is Frank and Julia's relationship with him. Frank is just a bad dude, and he summons Pinhead and his Cenobite cohorts to give him an experience he hasn't had before. He seems to be something of a sociopath who has done everything that you can possibly think of, and so he decides to open the door to heaven and hell and get an experience that way, which is a very interesting idea. That's sadomasochistic idea that this movie plays around with that I really enjoyed. I really liked that this movie is gross and weird, and that's the whole thing. It's very gross and weird, which I should talk about the special effects, which are fantastic. There's a couple that don't hold up super well, like when the hooks that Pinhead summons goes into somebody's skin. It looks just like gelatin. It looks terrible, really, just not very good, but that's like 1 or 2 shots in a movie that is stuffed with special effects. Not only are Pinhead and the Cenobites look great, not only do they look great, but that scene I mentioned earlier where Frank is getting reincarnated looks still great with that reverse photography. And then as he is becoming more and more human, you get to see him as like a skeleton with some muscles, and then you get to see like his nervous system. It's all great stuff. It looks fantastic. And then later in the movie, when Pinhead is taking out certain people, there's one part where the guy is like skin is getting pulled off his face, and it looks awesome still to this day. But another thing that I wanted to talk about is that while there are a lot of gruesome, disturbing images, like a guy's face being pulled apart, there is something hauntingly beautiful about it, not just in like the presentation of things, but with the ideas that's being presented. It is a much more intelligent, articulate horror movie than I would expect in this time period. I mean, you look at Pinhead and he just is very mannered, very particular.
He's alive!
Supposing he had escaped us, what has that to do with you?
And a lot of the shots and composition is like very horrific, but it still has this real elegance to it, which is something I did not expect from a Hellraiser movie, of all things. So, at the end of the day, I'd say it's definitely worth watching if you haven't seen it before. It is gruesome, it's disturbing, it's gross, and the special effects are fantastic. They still hold up very well, and I'm sure that people that don't really like blood or that type of thing are not gonna like this. They'll probably get nauseous, but for everything else that it does, for its weird thematics, for its strange main characters who aren't particularly likable, which is something I didn't particularly like about this. The main character, Julia, is just not a good person, and she's the main character, and then it completely shifts focus to her like stepdaughter, who kind of becomes the main character and saves the day at the end. Not sure I loved that, but I liked that it was so different, so clever, and so creative. So if you haven't seen Hellraiser, check it out. It's a very interesting movie. So that's all I gotta say.